Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So today, because I posted several podcasts, Philosophy Bites podcast, one with Jesse Prinz, a famous philosopher, who Prinz, his entire body of research is devoted to examining the relationship between art and the emotions, right? And Prinz has this is an interesting concept of the emotions and how they came to be, why they evolved, right, and what they do. So, uh, on Prinz's view, right, uh, danger, for example, in the environment reliably causes distinctive bodily changes, so that these bodily changes can represent the danger. So we're back to this notion of representation, right? Um, if you see, I don't know, fire, your mind, right, undergoes a physiological state in which you represent danger to yourself, and that's the emotion. Uh, on Prince's view, and there's another philosopher we'll talk about, Jennifer Robinson, on her view, right? Emotions, their theory is that the emotions evolved to guide action, right? Um, but now we come to a really interesting question. Well, then, what does art represent to us, right? Um, the emotions evolve to guide action. Certain stimuli in the environment invoke emotions, right? So, what does art invoke in us? Well, some philosophers have argued, Clive Bell, for example, we're talking about him this first week, or the first week. Um, he famously argues that art invokes a kind of silent awe, right? We see a great painting or a great sculpture, and we're in a kind of awe. We're awestruck by it. Um, it is interesting because you have philosophers like Roger Scruton, for example. We'll be talking a lot about Scruton. He famously argues that music is a non-representational form of art. Music doesn't represent anything for us. Kendall Walton, on the other hand, you'll see this in this interview with him that I'm going to post a little bit later. He thinks that art does represent, or excuse me, music does it is a representational form of art. It does represent something to us. Um, what I would argue music represents to us is the content of our emotional states, and music does this much better, much more effectively, that is, than does any other kind of art form. Um, Still, it's strange that art is a medium. It's a stimulus. Let's put it that way. It's a stimulus, right? That might invoke disgust or anger or joy or any number of complex emotions, right? And just you should know this, just FYI. Psychologists and philosophers and neuroscientists are still hashing out just exactly what an emotion is. We we now believe that there are emotions that are primary, fear, love, etc. And then there are more complex emotions, you call them secondary emotions, that are built upon these primary emotions. So something like injustice would be a secondary emotion. It's a very complex emotion that involves a cognitive assessment of a certain situation, and then a judgment on that situation, which is the emotion of injustice, right? But you should know, that psychologists, philosophers, etc., are still hashing out the details of just exactly what it is for any organism, let alone a human, to experience an emotional state. Um, but if Prinz and Robinson are right, and emotions evolved to guide us, to guide action, right? That's their primary purpose, to guide an organism's action. It's really strange to think, or to see how the emotions that are invoked by art do this, because as has been noted from philosophers from Kant and Schopenhauer on, art doesn't really do anything for us, and by that I mean it doesn't threaten us. It doesn't threaten our existence. It doesn't necessarily. It isn't advantageous for us in any way, and yet we have very strong emotional reactions to art. especially music. Again, so why would this be the case? Why would we react so intensely, emotionally to art? And I think that's because this is my musings on the topic. Art, more so than any other human cultural artifact, is strongly linked to ethics, to assessments of right and wrong. Again, those complex emotional states. For whatever bizarre reason, our this is again my hypothesis exclusively, and I'd like to see if anyone's in psychology is doing active research on this. But um, my thesis is that our ability to produce art, whatever for whatever reason we started producing art, whether it was cave paintings or just a simple whatever the first form of music was, it was to facilitate moral development in human beings, right? Um, and to give you an example of a philosopher who really has elaborated on this quite a bit, Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, right? He talks about the waning of religious belief in the West. We're becoming increasingly secularized. And again, remember, he's writing in the late 19th century. That secularization is even more prominent here in the early 21st century. Um, but religious belief was always a source of value. Well, what can replace religious belief as a source of value? And Nietzsche says great art. And for a long time, when I was while I was an undergraduate studying philosophy, even through my graduate career, I really disagreed with Nietzsche. I didn't think art could replace religion as a source of values. That we'd have to look somewhere else for values. But now, as I get older, and I think I just understand Nietzsche more. I'm more sympathetic to him. I definitely see what he means. Art is unquestionably a source of value. So as you're listening to the interview today, or this week with Jesse Prinz, think about these questions. What is that relationship between art and the emotions? And make some contribution, weigh in with your assessment in the discussion board.